Next up, we have a co-presentation about co-management from the co-offices of the Nature Conservancy. First off, we have Michael Bell, who is the, what's your title now? The
Director of the Coastal and Marine Program.
Director of Coastal and Marine Program of the Nature Conservancy and the California chapter. And we also have Jodie Toft, who's a marine ecologist with the Washington chapter of Nature Conservancy. As Joe alluded to, there's been a development of a co-management model off the coast of California where the Nature Conservancy has played a major role in helping to structure. I think you'll find that this is a pretty interesting concept they've been putting together. And more recently, the Washington chapters have been trying to engage in an established cooperative off the southern Washington coast and develop some of the same methods there. So I won't take much time talking. This isn't about me. So thank you, Michael.
Thanks, Merrick. Sounds like it's on. I wanted to start off by saying thank you so much for inviting the Nature Conservancy and Jodie and I here to speak, Merrick and Andre and the rest of the organizers, Dave. It's been a tremendous event. It's very timely. It's been incredible. Very much enjoying the face-off between the North Pacific and Pacific Councils as well. That's been great. So the Nature Conservancy has a 60-year history in conservation. And we've been working with small and large communities, quite frankly, around the world on natural resource management problems. And our work in fisheries is really much shorter legacy there. We've probably been working in fisheries for about 15 years. Quite a bit of engagement there came from our work in the West Coast groundfish fishery here. And so we're going to talk about the lessons that we've learned about co-management, this idea of organizing and empowering and creating a larger role for local fishery stakeholders in the management structure. I think Joe walked us through a very adult conversation, I would say, about the California risk pool. I'm going to take that bar down, way down. But we have pretty pictures, so we got that going for us. So here's what we intend to do with this talk. I'll talk a little bit, very high level, about our perspective on co-management, why the Nature Conservancy is involved, why we think it's a valuable tool for fishery management. Very quickly touch on how the Nature Conservancy got involved in the West Coast groundfish fishery and our work here. And then get a little more specific in these two examples of co-management projects, the California Quota Risk Pool and Community Quota funds that are emerging in the Central Coast of California as well. I'm going to hand it off to Jodie at that point, and she's going to take us through how these co-management entities and these advancements in co-management are creating these really awesome opportunities in collaborative research. And there's a few great examples of that in Jodie's talk. And then Jodie will conclude with, again, some pretty high-level messages from our perspective on MSA, how Magnuson-Stevens Act has really allowed for these co-management enterprises to emerge, and perhaps how it can do more along the lines of what Joe Sullivan talked about. So starting with the fishery management structure here within that manages the West Coast groundfish. Obviously, the primary management body here is the council working with NMFS, and they have a very big job. They manage diverse resources. There's 90 species, I think even more now, in the groundfish complex. 30 of those have a stock assessment, and there's always a desire to grow that number. A handful of those are in a depleted status, and so they're being adaptively managed under rebuilding plans. These are species. Some of these species have a life cycle that depends on habitat in inches of water in estuaries, depend on kelp forests, depend on the habitats of expansive mud and sand flats, offshore reefs, canyons, seamounts. Huge amount of variety in these habitats between the Mexican and Canadian border. Just very diverse and complex set of resource here. Socioeconomics are just as complex and diverse. In this fishery, you have small ports, you have large ports, you have boats the size of the dory fleet that launch themselves off the sands of Southern California to go do day trips for groundfish. On the other end of the spectrum, you have mothership whiting vessels and everything in between. So a huge job here for the management structure. And in the middle of all that are the constituents, or the stakeholders, and of course that begins with fishermen, but also includes fishing communities, fish-dependent businesses like buyers and processors, environmental NGOs, academia, and that's really just the beginning of that list. Huge amount of constituents, people that depend on and or just care about how this fishery is managed. And when you start going to council meetings, one thing you learn is that the process works really well when they're facing a management challenge and these stakeholders are talking to each other. And so they go into the council meeting and there's some start to the process. There is some agreement on the right solution set for a very challenging management problem. On the other hand, it's really at its worst or most inefficient when that does not occur and stakeholders come in from all over the coast, haven't talked to each other. Public testimony is fascinating. You're seeing opinions and arguments from every possible conceivable angle. And then when they're done and exhausted themselves through hours and hours of public testimony, we all sit back in our chairs and stare at the council and expect them to do something brilliant to satisfy all of us. And so it really brings forth the need for more organization at the local level to meet management halfway. And this is one part of it, this idea of really preparing and having a stronger and a more organized role in the council process is one great thing that can come out of the organizing of fleets through risk pools or co-ops or just partnerships or community quota funds. But there's a lot more. These co-management structures can take on management measures, their own management measures, those that are complementary to the fishery management plan, of course. They can also bring in new stakeholders. They can bring in the Nature Conservancy or Environmental Defense Fund. They can bring in University of Washington or Cal Poly. And those stakeholders can bring in resources. You essentially have an opportunity through co-management, I think as Joe described well, to expand the pie of resources available for this tremendous management challenge in this fishery and other fisheries. One of the most powerful things about co-management, in our opinion, from a conservation perspective, is that, and this has been documented by Dr. Ostrom and others, is that when local stakeholders that depend on a nearby resource are organized, they tend to make decisions that are in the interest of long-term sustainability, long-term productivity and profitability of harvesting that resource. And when they're unorganized and acting as individuals, oftentimes short-term profitability will rule the day. So I thought this quote from Dr. Ostrom was really great. I don't read into it that she diminishes the value and the importance of something like reauthorization of Magnuson-Stevens Act, but I do feel that there's a challenge here to think about how we can get citizens more involved in the process, and we believe co-management's the way to do that. So before I go into describing these two case studies or co-management examples in this fishery, a little bit of background about how the Nature Conservancy first got involved. It was back in, I think, 2005, the council was working on the establishment of essential fish habitat areas for groundfish. And the Nature Conservancy, and partnering with Rod Fujita Environmental Defense Fund, were interested in approaching the fleet in California and seeing if there's a way to collaborate on a proposal for what these new upcoming closures would look like. And in the conversations that took place, we learned two important things. One, a lot of these fishermen were looking to get out. We've all heard about the decline of the fisheries through the late 90s and early 2000s. This was very hard hitting in the central coast of California. They had lost a lot of infrastructure already. It was hard to make a go of it. A lot of these permits and boats were already inactive. So a lot of these guys wanted to get out. The other thing we learned is that almost all of them liked this idea that if closures were coming, better to do it here locally, or to create that proposal here locally with them having a chance to have a pen in hand with a chart on the table and really determine what the outcome of this thing would be. So that idea of a locally derived proposal was somewhat attractive. And so we worked out an arrangement where we offered a private buyout of those fishermen and boats that wanted to get out of the fishery. And we also started the process, this collaborative process, where we would combine the best fisherman knowledge, the best science knowledge for this region, and develop a proposal for essential fish habitat. And this worked. We brought this proposal collectively to the council. They accepted it and implemented 3.8 million acres, or approved a plan for 3.8 million acres of essential fish habitat in this part of California, shown in that bottom map. And that was, again, really guided by the best scientific information we could find and fisherman knowledge. Also, a result of this project was the Nature Conservancy acquired 13 of the 23 trawl permits held in this region. And so that positioned us as something very unique and novel at that time, a conservation organization as a very large stakeholder in this fishery. And those permits put us in a position to be allocated quota when the new catch share management system came. And then a model of collaboration was really emerged. And I don't want to say that this process was all sunshine and roses. It was far from it. It was a very tough process, but I think at the end of the day, people walked away learning that local objectives for the fishery may be best met when we work together. And so from that point, we kept this partnership together. And in 2006 and 2007, we went through the council process again, and we were awarded an exempted fishing permit. And there's a lot of details of this exempted fishing permit, but what it really did was provide an opportunity for the community of Morro Bay to have a mini catch share program. This was 4 years before the implementation of the real catch share program. The challenge of the EFP was we would be awarded catch rights for target species. We'd be awarded a very small amount of catch rights for overfished species, typical to what you're going to see in the catch share program. And the test was to see if those could be managed collectively under something we were calling a community fishing association. And we ran this project from 2008 through 2010. And it was successful. The target species were caught, more fishermen got involved each year. We effectively avoided the overfished species, and we learned a ton through that process. And I just, looking back on it, I'm very impressed by the council and the stakeholders involved. I don't think our vision was perfectly clear, but there was an impression that this would be a good investment. This experiment of co-management and this community fishing association would be a good experiment to see if this is a tool for small-scale fishing communities in the new catch share management program. So the lessons we learned in that project were very much applied to the new catch share program. Joe talked at length about how intense of an issue the low and constraining amounts of overfished species are in this fishery. And it really drove a lot of fear in the years and months before implementation of the program. Joe didn't mention that in Fort Bragg actually did start to organize well before the catch share program was implemented, but not to create a risk pool. They organized to pool their resources to hire an attorney to fight the implementation of the catch share program. And so that's really where that organization began. And to much credit of Merrick and Joe and other people involved, and the leaders really in these fishing communities of Half Moon Bay, Morro Bay, and Fort Bragg, we started talking and we got together and desired to implement this solution of a risk pool. It's really borrowed from the insurance industry. And the agreement of the risk pool, again, thanks to Joe for developing this, is an agreement between these 3 fishing marketing associations. And what these marketing associations are essentially doing is pooling all of their overfished species quota. The Nature Conservancy contributes to that as well. The total amount of target species held by these associations in the risk pool is 15 million pounds. And they're using the best co-management processes, technology, and collaborative, and they're actually investing in collaborative research as well, which Jodie will talk more about. So to have this insurance policy of overfished species quota so that incidental catch of overfished species don't affect their operations, they've agreed to develop fishing plans and really constantly promote best management practices. One of the things they're doing is using a system called eCatch. They have an iPad on board that logs automatically the date, time, geographic location, and they're putting in catch information of targets and overfished species. And this is what eCatch looks like online. It creates a lot of information. It maps this information in real time, then making it available to those working in the risk pool. And it creates these really cool products that can be accessed by the fishermen or accessed by scientists working with them. This looks like a search of all catch events maybe in 1 year. If you were on eCatch and you go to one of these tabs and click on it, out pops a bubble showing the time, date, depth, catch of that event. That allows us to start analyzing this information over time, and the more time passes, the more powerful this data set becomes. And we start seeing hotspots and understanding how these catch interactions are trending. And then, of course, all of this information goes into guiding what these fishing plans look like. And Joe talked about this a little bit, but these things are very adaptively managed. One story last August, there was a boat in Fort Bragg that caught a yellow eye, and he came back to port after catching that yellow eye rockfish, and the fishermen there put together a closure to incorporate in the fishing plan. So I had the privilege of going back to the board of the Nature Conservancy and saying, when they asked how's the risk pool going, I said, well, pretty well, I think. Fishermen are establishing their own closures. And what? They're just simply amazed. And I think, as conservationists, there may be too much focus in trying to apply the most innovative solutions, spatial management, information sharing in a top-down way. And sometimes when we're trying to push that in a top-down way, it's seen as a threat. And so you get resentment from the bottom up. And there seems to be a lot more impact when we're working from the bottom up. These tools become the stakeholders, not the victims of someone trying to push that tool on them. This is the catch results of our work thus far. The risk pool, this is the utilization rates in red of the risk pool, utilization rates of the fleet in gray. The risk pool has consistently had better utilization rates, higher utilization rates than the fleet-wide average on the target species. And some amount lower of utilization on the overfished species. I'll leave that there, but that information is available in reports that are submitted every year to the council by the risk pool voluntarily, which I can get to you. So now I'll switch over to the Morro Bay Community Quota Fund and just say a few words about this. There is obviously a concern about consolidation and these small communities losing their access in this fishery. This has led to a conversation in the ports like Fort Bragg, Monterey, and Morro Bay of forming a new nonprofit organization that can acquire, hold, and manage overfished species, quota, not just overfished species, but quota. this is what the Morro Bay Community Quota Fund is well ahead probably of the rest here. They're likely going to do their first quota deal next month or sometime this spring with the Nature Conservancy. And this is kind of how it looks, and I'll finish with this slide. The board of the quota fund was created by these local stakeholders to include scientists, to include local fishermen, and also include leaders in the community. The quota fund will acquire quota. It will lease it down to fishermen at below market rates so that they can meet their objectives. One of their objectives is to create a pathway for new entrants in the community to get into the fishery. They plan to manage their overfished species through the risk pool. And very interestingly, they expect to have some amount of profit, and a portion of which they want to invest directly into collaborative research projects. So research is probably a good segue for me to finish and talk about how, and hand this off to Jodie to talk about how these co-management arrangements are really promoting good collaborative research locally as well.
All right, how's that? So the last time I stood here was when I defended my dissertation, and I'm hoping that this crowd is as nice or nicer than that crowd. I choose to think you're all nicer. Great, so thank you so much, Michael, for that great background and introduction into what I think is a really exciting body of work that the Nature Conservancy has been involved with in the last 10 years or so on the West Coast. I'm excited to pick this up and move into a bit of a discussion about some of the actual science that we've done, collaborative research projects that we've done with fishermen and with other partners on the coast, and then talk a little bit about Magnuson-Stevens, what it's done for us so far and what it can do for us in the next round, I'd say. And so I'll dive into 3 projects to talk about the science and research that we've done through co-management. I think that all of these are fairly innovative. First, I'll talk about a trawl habitat impact study and then a rockfish conservation area assessment. Both of these have been done off Central California with Michael's team. And then the third project is here in Washington waters, working with a group of partners in Ilwaco, which is at the mouth of the Columbia, on a selective Lingcod trapping project that I'm involved in and very excited about. So let's start in California, and then we'll come back to Washington. First off, the Central Coast Trawl Impact and Recovery Study. So when we think about our waters off the Central Coast or off the Washington coast, we've got some waters that are set aside in rockfish conservation areas meant to kind of safeguard some of these overfished species from bycatch and also provide refugia. And then there's a whole bunch of other area that I'll call our working seafloor. And one of the big questions that came about collaboratively by working with our teams was thinking about on the working seafloor, what are the actual habitat impacts that we see from trawling? So can we work these seafloors? Can we work certain habitats? And can we have a better understanding of what those different types of fishing, in particular trawling, does to those different habitats? And so we worked, the Nature Conservancy worked with partners from Cal State Monterey Bay, worked with fishermen that we were already working with on Central Coast, and then also consulted also with members from the NOAA Fisheries, Northwest Fisheries Science Center here in Seattle, to dive into a study to trawl in certain areas off the Central Coast and use ROVs and dig into this question a little bit more about what are some of the impacts that we might see from trawling on these soft bottom habitats. Here's a map of the study area off of Morro Bay, and we chose areas to trawl in that were obviously not in the rockfish conservation area, but were about 90 fathoms, areas that had been trawled previously, but really hadn't been trawled since 2000. And so in 2009 until 2012, we trawled in certain areas. Shown here, we've got 4 control plots and 4 trawl plots, and trawled low intensity and high intensity in the trawl plots, and then had the control plots, obviously, for control. And we wanted to get at 3 questions. How did the microtopography complexity of the seafloor and invertebrate density differ between the trawled and controlled plots over time in a depositional soft sediment environment? How did spatial and temporal patterns in seafloor community structure vary under different levels of trawling intensity and over time after trawling? And then what was actual catch of flatfish and bycatch associated species using trawl gear in this soft bottom habitat? This last one is where I'll link up right away with the rest of the Central California work. What is the bycatch of associated species? If we're going to have bycatch, it would be really nice to be able to have quota, right? Because we need to have quota if we're catching that bycatch. Fortunately, there was something called the California Risk Pool, which you may have just heard about from Michael, and this was a great opportunity for us to kind of dance and weave and have that quota that we would need to cover any bycatch that we would actually catch of overfished species covered by the risk pool. So this was a great way in which another type of co-management really came and could support a different type of collaborative research that we had underway. So by dropping an ROV down, so we would trawl, drop an ROV down, take some samples, process, what did we actually see? We didn't see a lot. Okay, so trawl door scour marks persisted for about up to a year, maybe longer. That's as far out as we sampled in these soft bottom sediments. There's minimal impact to the microtopographic structure on the seafloor following both of the low and high intensity trawling. No measurable impacts of trawling on the invertebrate densities. And we saw that, I think many of us in this room have done research on this. There's a lot of variability in the background signal and the background state of the system about how the invertebrate densities varied. And that there's really was no difference in the composition of the infaunal invertebrates between the trawled and control plots. So we didn't see a lot of differences from control plots and trawl plots in these soft bottom habitats. And aside from the general partnership building and really forging forward and kind of aligning all of our fish in the same direction to think about what our common objectives were when entering into a research program, there's a lot of gains from that. But then if we also think about just the actual findings, they think there's scientific merit in being able to move forward in collaborative research in this vein. And then if we also think a little bit more about, well, as we start to do a better job informing where we want to allow certain types of fishing and not allow certain types of fishing, how can this type of information be used to inform some of those decisions? I think that can be pretty useful. So the second project I want to dive into is, again, working with partners in, working with a team in Central California. And this is really all about what's going on in the rockfish conservation areas. So the project's entitled Supporting a Spatial Analysis of the Distribution and Size of Rebuilding Stocks in the Rockfish Conservation Areas through Directed Fishing Surveys. So you'll see a whole bunch of logos on the bottom because, again, as we talk about co-management or collaborative research, there's usually a lot of people involved. And I think Nature Conservancy felt really fortunate to have built these relationships over time and then be in a space where we could not only do the project that I just mentioned, but do this project as well and really look at different angles of, well, what's a working seafloor? How can we work in the seafloor and what does that mean? And then to ask the question about, well, if we're thinking about the rockfish conservation areas, these really broad brush areas, what's the conservation value of having these areas? And then as we enter into this kind of interesting dynamic of big area closed down for rockfish conservation, shift to ITQs, how do those play off each other, and what type of information might we need that could improve any conversations now and in the future about how those different management tools work together convergently or divergently in the future. And the place that we landed on collaboratively was to say, we don't necessarily have the greatest sense of what's going on in some of the habitats in the rockfish conservation areas. There's probably some hot spots for species, for overfish and target species. There's probably some cold spots. Can we do a really good job working with partners to figure out, to bring the best available science together and do some predictive modeling to figure out where we think the distributions of these different overfished and target species can be, and then can we actually get in there and do some targeted sampling for these hot spots, cold spots, and maybe warm spots to test that to ground truth what's coming out of the models. And so what we did, here I'm showing on the left a map that we put together with partners from NOAA's biogeography team. And here we had 15 maps put together of overfished species and target species along the whole coast. And these were the maps that we used then to identify where we wanted to do our sampling to ground truth some of these maps. Here's a map of all the sampling locations. And what I want to mention here is that, so using, with an exempted fishing permit, because obviously we couldn't just go into the RCA and start fishing willy-nilly. So with an exempted fishing permit, we figured out all these locations and then went in with fixed gear into the, all the pink locations are the fishing set locations, and then also had innovative video design, which I'll show you on the next slide, that we could drop down so that we could have a look at not just what we're catching when we're dropping our fixed gear, but also have a look at what the habitat looks like, who's coming, who wants to come visit our nice video machine underwater, and get a better sense of the distribution of the OFS based on our video surveys. Here it is. Everybody likes a picture of some fancy gear that goes underwater, and that's it. So this is, it's basically, the way I look at it is it's a really tricked out crab pot. Okay, that probably costs a lot more money. So using this system, it was a video system that you can drop down, have video, 360-degree video panning around, baited with squid. You can drop it down to about 300 meters. It's got a live video feed capturing information online. It's, you know, it's your Tesla of well, gear, I suppose. And so and so what we've done so far in this project, we've been out for a year, sampling, collecting video, processing the video. What we're finding is that we're doing a pretty good job finding the hot spots and staying away from the cool spots, or validating the model results. I'd say we're doing a pretty good job. We've done a good job testing out how well we can use the results that are coming from the gear, about 2 to 5% error in actually sizing the fish. And then there's 2 points that I want to mention about this research that I think are really exciting. One is the exact same point I made before. Where do we get the quota to cover any bycatch of overfished species? Again, you've got this really great system where you've set up a risk pool, and there's flexibility in the design of that risk pool to be able to support this type of collaborative research, okay? So the thing that you might be most worried about or might most want when doing collaborative fishing is some of this quota of overfished species, and that's something that we could get from the California risk pool. And then the second item that particularly coming out of Fishery Science School, that I think is so exciting is how are we going to use any of these data to inform fishery management decisions that may happen. So I think a really great part of this research is a collaboration with John Field from the Southwest Fishery Science Center in working with him and figuring out what are ways that we can use these data, which aren't traditional data that would be used in stock assessments, but what are ways that we can use these data to help inform conversations around species distribution of OFS and target species, et cetera, et cetera. And so when thinking about designing some of these collaborative research projects, I think it's always, for me, it's an easy no-brainer and a nice win when you can make sure that you've got the partnership set in place to be able to think about that conduit of information and how you can make that the best conduit for trying to inform decisions that may be made around where fish are and where we can go to catch them. And then the last project that I want to talk about is Lingcod. So here's the beautiful Lingcod underwater. So this is a project that the Nature Conservancy has stepped into recently with a group of fishermen out of Ilwaco, Washington, which is at the mouth of the Columbia. So we're working with the Ilwaco Fishermen and Marketing Cooperative and the University of Washington as well on this project. The Ilwaco Fishermen and Marketing Cooperative is another part of the story of risk pools on the West Coast. So the boats that fish out of Ilwaco fish in a bit of a different way than the ones in Central California. The ones up here are targeting a higher volume of fish. They participate a bunch in the Alaska fisheries, as well as fisheries off the West Coast here. And initially, when all the conversation was circling around risk pools into Central California, Ilwaco was part of those conversations. However, when really diving into this innovative process of setting up a risk pool, eventually Ilwaco said, you know what, let's let Central California work on its own, and we are going to actually set up our own risk pool here. But those areas, so although they're distinct risk pools, I'd say that the conversations that informed creation of both of those risk pools were shared, at least in some way. So I think that's good. And so one of the reasons that TNC has landed with the Ilwaco Fishermen and Marketing Cooperative is because of the work that Michael Bell and his team in California did and all of those conversations. And so this was a real natural evolution for the Nature Conservancy to move up into Washington waters with this group and start thinking about different ways that we might want to work with them. Different ways we might want to work with them on collaborative research and co-management. And don't worry, I'll return to the University of Washington partnership as well. So what are we doing with Lingcod? Why do we care about Lingcod? The project that we're doing with IFMC, as I'll call our Ilwaco partners from now on, is about designing a pot or a trap so that we can target Lingcod and not catch OFS, okay, and halibut. So what we want to be able to do is develop this pot or trap so that we can get Lingcod in the habitats where we know that we can't trawl without catching so much OFS that it would shut us down. Even with a risk pool, there's not a huge amount of OFS that we'll be able to deal with. Trawling for Lingcod has not worked very well for them, and over the last 3 years, they've left about 75% of their Lingcod quota in the water. Okay, that's a lot of profit that's just getting wet and not getting into our mouths here in Seattle. The other side of the Lingcod justification is that Lingcod, I'm guessing we can guess why I'm showing this picture here, Lingcod like to eat something called rockfish. And so can we dig a little bit more into what the role could be of removing that predation pressure on rockfish exerted by Lingcod and how that can be kind of a trade-off in thinking about building out a Lingcod fishery, rockfish recovery. Finally, it's not quite time for lunch, but we'll get there soon. Lingcod, might we think of this as sableFish's cute little twin? Sablefish, nice price per pound when caught in a selective gear type. Is there a potential to do the same for Lingcod? I think there's a good question there, and Nature Conservancy has started exploring some of those conversations about taking the price per pound of Lingcod, currently about $1 a pound on the docks, and can we bump that up if we can spin it out and fish it with a selective gear? So the gear here that we're working with, this is all fisherman-led design. Do I know anything about designing a Lingcod pot? I think we can probably guess the answer to that. But do these guys? Yes, they have a much better sense, or so they say. Testing will prove that out. They certainly have a much better idea than I do. So we're testing a variety of pots this summer that they've designed. Those pots are designed on assertions about how Lingcod will stay low and rockfish will go high, and also gear that's been tested in other places, allowing for Lingcod to get in while keeping halibut out and keeping rockfish out. So we'll be out on the water this summer testing some of these designs along the Washington coast, so I'm excited to see what we find. And then, yum. And then on the University of Washington side, well, there's so many interesting questions around this gear testing and design. There's also bigger questions, that one of which I alluded to earlier with the Lingcod rockfish picture. How do we start digging into this question about what removal of Lingcod means for recovery of rockfish? So we're working with Tim Essington here at the University of Washington at SAFS to start digging into a bit of this food web work. And then we're also working with Chris Anderson. Saw a great talk from him yesterday, all about ecosystem-based businesses, okay? So I like to take my own spin on it, and I like to say that Chris is digging into the if you build it, will they come analysis, which is if we can show that this pot works, and if you can understand something about the nature to which fishermen on the West Coast operate as ecosystem-based businessmen, where is the potential space for different fishermen to adopt different gear types, such as this Lingcod trap? So there, I just want to finish out the kind of the collaborative research work that we're doing and reflect on how I think the work Michael talked about and the work I've talked about has fallen out for Magnuson-Stevens, how it's worked or hasn't worked. So I'll talk briefly about where it works with the current MSA, and then also about Magnuson-Stevens Act as it could be reauthorized, and where there might be more space to build out space for co-management and collaborative research. So currently under MSA, I'll just say that I think there's good language in the MSA right now that creates the conditions. Over the last 10 years, we've been able to work on collaborative research, work towards co-management, and there is good language. There's a lot of shalls in the current MSA about developing a framework for collaborative research and experimental fishing, fishing communities, regional fishery association. There's some good shall language in there, and that's been a great place to build from. However, I think as we move forward into the next version of MSA, I think that we need to recognize a cycle that we've seen through MSA for the past number of years. So with MSA, we have the adopt, add some language, learn, adopt, learn, adapt, okay? So I think since the last version of MSA, there's been the language there's been a lot of really great learning that's happened, partnerships developed, et cetera, and now we're in a good place to actually move forward on the shalls and define a framework for what MSA can do around co-management, around collaborative research, and how we can develop process to support that framework. But I want to end with a couple points. Why do we need to do this? It's nice to check it off the to-do list for the shalls, but I'd say we've heard a lot of talk yesterday, in particular, about what the costs are of changing and implementing MSA, what the costs are to collect data, what the costs are of litigation. There's a lot of gains that think we've seen so far from co-management, either in covering some of those costs, diffusing the conversations, or just diffusing the arguments before they get to the point of litigation. There's just a bunch of different ways that I think co-management and collaborative research gains can help us move forward on some of these sticking points around costs. And lastly, I just want to note that I think for the Nature Conservancy, this has been a really great space to work in, to try to figure out where the best move is off the soapbox and around the table with a variety of partners, and figuring out really creative ways to gather data, to create partnerships, to help fishermen stay in the water, all on the West Coast. And I know we're really excited to see how some of our new efforts in Washington waters, California waters, Oregon waters kind of bear fruit or catch fish in coming years. And with that, I'll just say thank you.